And yes, that home in Orlando and Soweto becoming a platform for many of the tributes that we've seen, and the family is gathered there. We'll bring you that visit by the National Executive Committee of the ANC tomorrow. Bongani?
Thank you, Francis. A British filmmaker who's won a prestigious award at the Sundance Film Festival for her documentary about Winnie Madikizela-Mandela says her film goes some way to push back against the years of state-sponsored propaganda that were centered on discrediting the South African icon. Pascale Lamche won the Director's Prize at last year's Sundance Film Festival for her documentary Winnie. It premiered in South Africa last year in front of its subject, family and friends. Ms. Lamche says her film was welcomed by Winnie herself as a true portrayal of her life. Our London correspondent Catherine Drew has been talking to her about the film and asking her why she set to make it in the first place.
Noticed that wherever I travelled in the world, whether in America or throughout Europe, whenever I mentioned my interest in Winnie, the response was so negative. It was, always there was this sort of firm belief in people who really didn't know the story and hadn't bothered to dig very deep, that she'd been a murderer, that she'd been, all sorts of very, very dark things, and that she'd brought the Mandela name into disrepute and worse. So I was interested in the lack of fit between that view and what I knew existed in South Africa.
Pascale, why do you think there was this disconnect between how Winnie was viewed in South Africa and the wider African continent, and how she was seen in Europe and the US?
Well, partly as a consequence of a very, very effective program of propaganda program, really, run by, and when you see the film, the director of something called Stratcom, which was a whole operation of psychological warfare that was put into place under P.W. Botha, and in which the tarnishing of Winnie's reputation became, a focus.
Would you be prepared to take up a gun and kill someone in order to achieve your freedom?
Now I know I can.
Pascale, your film has been criticised by some for brushing over Winnie's criminal convictions and what they've called some ugly truths. Do you think that's fair?
No, I don't. I mean, already to say these ugly truths, the film has 90 minutes, in fact 84 minutes, to begin to run slightly counter to the prevailing narrative. I had and I have the material and would have liked to have made a 6-part series. So for me, the priority was not just to rework, which is what journalists do rather lazily throughout the world, rework the same old stories, but to actually try and look at it on many levels and at a much deeper, from a more political perspective, to analyse her and her relationship with Nelson in the context of the times. So to understand how a major female political figure is taken out of the public sphere, because of course she was undisciplined. The ANC had been established in association with the Communist Party, so it was a very structured organisation in which no one was supposed to take an independent voice, if you like, without checking with the party hierarchy.
Now, you've said that Nelson and Winnie Mandela were two sides of the same powerful coin, but something terrible had been done to them. What do you mean by that?
In my view, had they been permitted to stay as a couple, even though inevitably he was in jail for 27 years, in that time, she was a much younger woman than him, and he went to jail when she was a very young woman. She had obviously had relationships with other men over that time, but she was so condemned when he came out for being herself in love with a lawyer, with somebody else. There was someone else in her life. But they could have maintained a relationship, they could have carried on and had the relationship that they had, which was a political one. Had they stayed together, I think the combination of his very middle of the road attitude towards what needed to be done, and her more socialistically inclined, thinking about education, thinking about housing, thinking about sharing the wealth more effectively, rather than a sort of business as usual kind of scenario. That dialogue would have been better for South Africa than what in effect came to pass.
So you've discussed this idea a lot, that Nelson Mandela was seen as the saint and Winnie Mandela was seen as the sinner. Do you think your film goes some way to redress that?
Yes, I hope so. I mean, it's their daughter, Zinzi Mandela, who articulates that in the film. She says, you know, and then they set up my father as the saint and my mother as the sinner. And I asked myself, how do you even dare do that?
We were the cannon fodder, we were the foot soldiers, and we were exposed to the viciousness of apartheid.
So did Winnie like your film?
She did, and in fact it was very moving, because we had a premiere in Johannesburg. It was massively attended, it was fantastic. She came. I had thought that her daughter had seen the film beforehand and mildly vetted it at least, but she hadn't. I discovered on the day, so I was quite nervous. But it was incredibly moving. There was a standing ovation. Everybody stood up in the cinema and applauded her for a very, very, very long time. And she was in tears and overwhelmed. And I got news thereafter, in a private dinner party amongst her and her family, to say that this was the first time any representation of her had actually realised a true picture of her.
In light of your film, how do you think Winnie Madikizela-Mandela should be remembered?
She should be remembered as a radical socialist, I think, and a woman who fought ceaselessly, tirelessly, courageously, and all her life for against what was in effect a white supremacist, deeply violent system. People forget. And she was tremendously brave. She kept Nelson's name alive, but she did a lot more than that. And whether you know, people say one person's freedom fighter is another person's terrorist, wherever you sit on that line, she nevertheless had the force of her convictions. And because she was a woman, you know, this notion that you stand up and you're counted and you shout, people don't like that from women. So she was a very brave and very powerful political figure, but who was very effectively politically neutralized. But I hope that in the long run, her contribution to the struggle against a really terrible system, which carried on until 1994 to our collective shame, you know, propped up by the United States, by Britain, etc., etc. Her contribution to that struggle for freedom in South Africa was very, very profound, and I hope we celebrate her for that.